Bob sat in the break room reading a travel brochure when a female that worked with him entered the room and sat down. "Where are you planning to go, Bobby?" she asked. "Nowhere right now," he replied. "Jill and I was planning a trip to Belize later, but I can't get her to stop long enough to help me plan." At 35, Bob was working as a broadcast engineer, the job was going great, and he was married to Jill, also 35, who was an executive working for a multinational company. That afternoon Bob was planning to travel out to where their station's transmitter was located to run some tests and go from their home. As Bob was putting away the trash from his meal, his phone text alert went off and he noticed it was from Jill. "Last minute change of plans, Boo," Jill said in the text. Boo was her pet name for Bob. "I won't be home for dinner, sorry, I will make it up to you this weekend." Bob put his phone away and loaded up some equipment and left the station. On the way he stopped at a local quick stop and got a cup of coffee. When he got to the transmitter, he called the security company and using his passcode told them he was entering the fence and the building. In the back of his mind, as he worked, his mind went to Jill. She was hardly ever at home these days and it was starting to piss him off. After replacing some panels, he closed the building and left. He called the security company and told them he was gone. The trip home was uneventful, and he got home about 3 p.m. Bob was not in the mood to cook, so he decided to call and have a pizza delivered. Bob had recorded several football games from the previous weekend, so he sat after his shower and watched one as he ate. Then about 8 p.m. went to bed. After sending Bob a text, Jill sat in her office waiting for a reply. She knew what she was doing was wrong. In her mind she had already justified sleeping with one of the company vice presidents because Bob had no ambition, and she knew in 30 years Bob would be doing the same thing he is doing now. Jill had already passed Bob's yearly income. She did feel some guilt because Bob paid for her education. Still, "I need this." Jill was a beautiful blonde that excited every male she worked with. Nelson stuck his head in the door and asked Jill, "Are you ready to leave?" "Yes, Nelson, give me a minute to finish this memo and I will see you in the lobby." Jill finished, pulled her card out of the computer keyboard, got up, grabbed her purse and briefcase and left. Meeting Nelson in the lobby, both headed out to his apartment about 10 miles away. Just before midnight Nelson called his driver to take Jill back to the company garage and make sure she safely got in her car. Jill walked into her home at almost 1 a.m. She quickly took a shower and got in bed with Bob, got up close to Bob and hugged him, then fell fast asleep. Bob heard Jill enter the room. He just played like he was sleeping. As he laid there, Bob knew something was wrong. That next morning Bob got up at about 5 a.m., put on his running clothes and ran about 2 miles. When he got back home, he noticed Jill was still asleep. Bob made some breakfast and sat down to eat. Jill was still asleep when he got a shower, put on his clothes and left for work. When Bob got to the station he scanned through the overnight logs to see if there was anything he needed to do. All seemed well, so he walked to his office and started writing some reports. Jill heard Bob get in the shower and expected him to come over to kiss her. When he had just left, Jill started to wonder if Bob suspected anything. She got up expecting to see some breakfast made for her. Nothing, so she grabbed some leftover pizza and sat down to eat. Nelson had told her several months ago he was going to make some adjustments in his life and would ask Jill to marry him. Jill had not gave him an answer, but she knew deep down inside she still loved her Boo. As she sat there she remembered the words to the Kenny Rogers song "Daytime Friends and Nighttime Lovers." Lord, it hurts her doing this again. Jill knew she had a meeting in about an hour, so she ran upstairs and got dressed. Back at the station Bob decided he had enough of Jill's late-night meetings. Bob started to use his fingers to count the number of days since he last made love to Jill. As he sat he thought about how excited Jill was when she got that job after she graduated from school. Those first few years was wonderful. Then something happened and then most evenings he was alone. He scolded himself for allowing this to go on. "Well, it ends this weekend," Bob said. The station manager came into Bob's office and wanted to know what was bugging him. Bob said, "Boss, I think Jill is cheating on me." "Boss, let me correct that. I think Jill is either cheating or about to. I feel her distance from me now." The manager suggested to Bob, telling him to speak to the program manager because he had just gone through a divorce and according to him his attorney was very good. Bob made a mental note to speak to him when he got over to the main station offices that day. When Jill got to work, Nelson entered her office and asked, "Are we on for tonight, Jill?" "Not tonight, Nelson. Tonight, I need to be home. In fact, I am leaving after lunch to make Bob a nice dinner." Nelson replied, "Why are you still living with that loser Jill? I have told you many times to come move in with me. I want you to have my children, Jill." Jill looked at Nelson and said, "You already have some kids." Nelson got a serious look in his eyes and walked closer to Jill. "Jill, what if I don't want you to go home at lunch?" he said. "Don't be silly, Nelson, I need to do this. Remember, I will be with you for the next 2 weeks while we travel to Europe. I need to devote some time to Bob." Bob stepped into the program manager's office and asked him if he had a minute. "Sure, Bob, have a seat." Over the next half hour Bob found himself crying as he told the story. The man reached into his desk and took out a card. "This is my attorney's number. I highly suggest you call her." He also called the station manager and the three men spoke. The program manager told Bob, "If Jill is cheating, it might help you to understand you are not alone. I went through this crap last year. I did okay in the divorce. Even though I lost a lot, I came out of the divorce with my self-respect." Then he looked at Bob and said, "Bob, if you decide to get out of the house for a while, I have a guest room with its own bathroom in my house and plenty of beer in my fridge." Bob smiled and left the room. The program manager told the station manager he needed to keep a close watch on Bob. There was a retired licensed engineer living in town. He was there at the request of the station owner. Bob knew this and was planning to ask for some time off. He also was not going home that night. Bob was told that he could take some time off starting that afternoon. The last thing Bob did before starting his car was to turn his phone off. He drove about 100 miles into the Shenandoah Valley to the home of his brother. He got there about dark, and his brother walked out to greet him. Mitch could see his baby brother was not in good shape. He just hugged him and said, "Let's get inside." They had dinner, talked about the problem, and Bob went to bed but slept fitfully. Jill was finished with the meal. On the way home she bought some fresh green peppers and all the things to make stuffed green peppers. This was one of Bob's favorite meals. Normally Bob was home by 5 p.m. By 7 p.m. Jill was getting concerned. At 7:30 she called the station and was told Bob left hours ago. Jill had texted Bob several times, she was not getting any replies. At 8 she decided to eat and placed the leftovers in storage containers and walked into the den and had a glass of wine. She wanted to get angry at Bob, but she knew she had went way too far with her evenings away. That night Jill went to bed crying and cried herself to sleep. That next morning Bob ate breakfast and started the long ride back home. He was going to take up the offer of the guest room. He needed to get some clothes and his personal things though. Bob got home about an hour after Jill left for work. He noticed the leftovers in the fridge when he got a Coke. So Jill made dinner last night, he thought. Well, too little too late, Jill, he said. He turned on his phone and several texts and some missed calls showed. He scanned through them all and cleared them. He called the number of the attorney and as luck would have it she had some time open that afternoon. He made an appointment. When Jill got to work she was thinking about the night before. She thought that she should stop her affair with Nelson before things got out of hand. She also for the first time gave some serious thought to not going to Europe. Then Nelson entered the office and Jill stopped thinking about her marriage. She would later bitterly regret her decision to travel to Europe. That night Jill stayed with Nelson. After his meeting with the attorney Bob walked out actually in a better mood. The attorney suggested a very good private investigator. This man was good at his job and well worth his fees. Bob went to the bank and got a cashier's check for the fees because Jill had access to the account, and he did not want her to know he had hired this man. When Jill got home that Saturday morning, she noticed the bed had not been slept in. She also noticed all of Bob's clothes was missing. She ran downstairs and discovered his school yearbooks, and some other mementos were missing too. She sat and tried to contact Bob. When she called the station, she was told Bob was on a leave of absence. Why was Boo not fighting for our marriage? Jill said to herself. Okay, well if that is how he wants to be, screw him. She called Nelson and said Bob was gone. Nelson said, come on over tonight, Jill, this is for the best and you know it as well as I do. Jill packed a small overnight bag and left the house. The investigator was sitting in his car about 300 feet away when he noticed Jill leaving. He followed her from a distance. When she got to the gated community, he knew he had to stop. So, he drove up to a small pull-off and opened his laptop and opened the tracking program. He had placed a GPS on Jill's car earlier. He could see exactly where the car was parked. He was able to get an address. He decided to stop and drove across town to work another job. He was going to see who owned the house at that address when he got back to his office. When Jill got to Nelson's home, he was waiting for her with an already poured glass of wine. Jill smiled as she entered the home. The day Jill and Nelson left for the airport, the investigator was following them. By the time they entered the terminal, the man knew he had enough to call Bob and make a report. That afternoon he had the full report ready. Bob knew who Nelson was. He took the report and gave a copy of the report as well as the photos and video to his attorney. In that state you can use adultery as grounds for divorce. Bob was also going to file a lawsuit against the company Jill worked for. This lawsuit was planned for after the divorce was final. The investigator was able to find Jill's travel plans and knew what flight she was due to return on. He gave this information to Bob's attorney, who then had the process server at the right spot to serve Jill when she cleared customs. The process server walked up to Jill and after asking her if she was Jill Marie Benning and once she said yes, handed her the paperwork and said, you have been served. Jill started to scream. Nelson was behind her when this happened. During the trip Jill had decided to stop seeing Nelson. In fact, she had decided to accept a job offer from another company. Jill turned to Nelson and said, my boo knows about us. Nelson said to Jill, this is not a bad thing. I have told you many times to dump that loser, he is not worth it. A subdued Jill went home. She knew she was going to need an attorney, so she hired one and when asked what she wanted said, my Bob back. Jill's attorney said he would contact Bob's attorney and see about setting up a meeting. When he learned about the requested meeting, Bob refused. Bob, you are going to have to meet at some point, his attorney told him. Bob said, I can't look at Jill right now. The wounds are still open and raw. Okay, she said and ended the meeting. Jill attempted to find Bob. She was finally told to stay off the station property. Bob had changed his phone number by that time. Nelson was getting upset. He had fallen in love with Jill the day he first met her. She was going to be wife number 3. He did not plan on Jill having feelings for Bob, and this made him angry. He knew he would win her in the end. He also knew once she was his he would never allow her to be around other men. The day Jill's attorney told her that Bob was going ahead with the divorce, she was upset. Every time she wanted something he let her have it. She wanted the house, Bob said okay. She wanted some of the paintings, Bob said okay. Finally, Jill said, I want Bob. Bob said no. The day of the hearing to finalize the divorce, Jill begged the judge to order marriage counseling, but he refused, stating it was a waste of time. That the husband was wanting free so bad he was giving you everything. The day the divorce was final, Jill woke up that morning in a foul mood. Depressed, she got up to shower. Nelson was still bugging her to live with him and sell the house. She was planning to put the house up for sale and move in with Nelson. Later that same day Bob made contact with his attorney and said, "Do it." Within about an hour a lawsuit was filed against the company Nelson and Jill worked for. The president of the company and Nelson were added as defendants. Two process servers entered the lobby of the company headquarters and asked to speak with their legal department. As attorneys they were legally bound to accept service for the company. Once the president entered the lobby he was served. It was almost 30 minutes later when Nelson was called into the legal department and there was also served. Bob had been told the lawsuit would not make it past the first hearing, but she knew the main purpose and was positive it would work. Yes, at the first hearing the judge tossed the case, but by then Nelson had been removed as a vice president and Jill had been fired. Jill sat in her car looking at all the boxes in her back seat and started to cry as she left the company property for the last time. That evening she was told to get out of Nelson's home. Jill finally decided to take a job offer in California and left. Bob sat down at his table in the small apartment he and Gidget shared. He placed his right hand on her swollen belly. Everything was right with the world. He would soon be moving to a bigger house soon. The media company that owned that station had sold it. Earlier that week he had been notified he would be the new station manager. Bob smiled as he took a sip of wine.